Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Tara Vogel, a person with GNE myopathy and a patient advocate program manager for the Neuromuscular Disease Foundation. I'm very pleased to be with you and to have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ms. Shira Emmons. For this speaker series, Sarah will share with us practical tools, suggestions, and the importance of navigating GNEM through self-care. Sarah earned a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Washington with a focus on health systems and population health. Currently, she is the Vice President for Patient Affairs and Community Strategies at the Jain Foundation, where she leads and implements patient identification and engagement efforts globally. Sarah interacts extensively across sectors to expedite diagnostic support and to align their community members for successful clinical trials. She also develops and manages the Foundation's Dysferlin Registry. If you are familiar with the Jain Foundation, you will know that it is quite similar to the Neuromuscular Disease Foundation, in which their mission is to get an effective therapy or cure for dysferlinopathy. 8 to 10 people per million are affected by this disease, and the foundation was started by a parent of a child affected with dysferlinopathy. At the end of Sarah's presentation, there will be time to ask questions, or if you want to, you may type your questions in the chat box. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sarah. Sarah?
Thank you, Tara. Well, a huge thank you to the NDF for inviting me to the speaker series, and to the GNEM community for your presence and for taking time to focus on self-care today. So what is self-care? We're going to talk about that. We're going to go through a general overview of self-care and try to infuse that overview with some practical, logistical discussion about what that looks like as you navigate symptoms of GNEM. One of the common threads throughout the patient community that I serve, among those individuals who are thriving and living their best lives, is self-care, and really a self-awareness and intentionality, finding ways to preserve their energy and tap into their innate passions despite the heavy challenges that they're experiencing and the changes in their body that they're constantly experiencing in micro moments throughout the day and each month. And so I think it's important to take a look back and identify ways that we can infuse self-care into our daily lives. So today I'll give a general overview of what self-care is, what that looks like as you're navigating progressive symptoms, and talk about the importance of reflection and really taking an inventory in your self-care practices. So hopefully we will be able to spark some thought and reflection on that for each person who's watching this webinar, and to begin to craft an individual customized framework and plan for you to begin to infuse self-care into your life as you navigate symptoms. At the end, we're going to talk about some resources and some fun apps that you might want to explore and check out to support you along the way. So what I'll do now is share my screen. Okay. If there's any issue with the screen at any point, just let me know, stop me. So first, we're just going to talk about the definition of self-care. There's actually been quite a bit of research in mental health research, and specifically looking at individuals in different populations. individuals who are elders, individuals with chronic symptoms, children, caregivers. So there's a great body of work dating decades now that validate self-care and the importance of it. And the more we learn about the body and the immune system and the relationship between the mind and the body, your thought process and your body process, we really can deepen our awareness of the importance of self-care. There's lots of definitions. The World Health Organization has definitions of self-care listed, but I really like this definition of self-care that I found from a group of nurses who wrote a great paper about self-care in practice with their profession, but they describe it as the ability to care for oneself through awareness, self-control, and self-reliance in order to achieve, maintain, or promote optimal health and well-being. What I love about this is it's focused on your ability. So much with regards to getting a diagnosis and navigating the medical system with a chronic neuromuscular progressive disease is disability, or what is going to be lost. And I think that it's really the root of self-care is focusing on awareness and your abilities. And so much power lies right in that mindset of ability and focusing on what we can control. And so that comes down to how we view our perspective, how we view ourselves, how we view our situations, and the grace that we give ourselves over and over again as we navigate challenges. Another definition of self-care can be very active and action-oriented. So self-care is deciding to prioritize your health and wellness. I love this because it's really, that is really at the heart of it all, is making a decision. And I think so many times we put off making decisions. Oh, I'll do that when I feel better, or I'll do that when I have time. But we can actually decide right now in this red hot moment to breathe a little deeper, or to listen as we're present with each other. We can also, in the background, be listening to our bodies. I think that we can turn that term, listening to our bodies, around. We hear that a lot in medical appointments, especially people without any particular guidelines for how to care for their muscles and their bodies. They get told often to listen to their body, which can be a bit frustrating to hear. Doesn't seem specific enough, but we can start to practice it in tiny moments throughout our day. So it's getting specific about making decisions to prioritize our health and wellness. Meeting yourself where you are right now is one point that I think is important to focus on today, that I have learned through my work with neuromuscular patient communities. And that is, right now is where we can focus in on what we need. Worrying about what we are going to be up against, or comparing ourselves to other people and how they are progressing, can be extremely destructive and not productive in terms of helping us navigate symptomatic change. And so meeting yourself where you are right now is your first step in terms of giving yourself the grace that you need to begin to build self-care muscles. Respecting your own individuality is definitely a point to contemplate. It might not be something you fully can wrap your head around today, but I would invite you to consider taking a look and an inventory of how well you are respecting yourself as an individual, the way you think about yourself, what you say to yourself silently throughout your day, what is going on with any management of anxiety or depression, how you're showing up for yourself, not for anybody else, not to appear a certain way for anybody else, but really just how well are you there for yourself. Respecting your own individuality is at the root of that, because self-criticism is very destructive. And so understanding that you are an individual, your individual GNEM progression is unique to you. And so comparing yourself can be extremely destructive. And I think that feeds into the practice and learning how to reframe how you envision wellness. So much of the definitions of wellness that I've come across are very able-bodied centric. And so even in clinical trials, the communities in rare disease have been working very hard to communicate and educate and bring awareness to the many able-bodied leaders who are setting the tone and rules for evaluation of new therapies are very able-bodied centric. And so it's very important to begin with yourself and reframe how you envision wellness, because you may have internalized one image for yourself of what wellness looks like. But as you're dealing with and navigating the changes in your body, there's going to need to be a sense of recalibrating how you see yourself and what your definition of wellness is for yourself. It needs to be very customized and tuned into your unique needs. So when we talk about self-care, we need to think of the two realms of the mind and the body. And so there's obvious physical practices of self-care that we all are already practicing. And as I was preparing this and thinking about this aspect of the mind and the body and some of the most basic practices of self-care, I thought about what it's like for young children to begin to learn self-care practices. And I find it precious to watch the joy that young children experience when they learn how to care for themselves. And I thought to myself, when does that joy go away? When does that sense of love for oneself and for the basic everyday practice of caring for yourself, when does that go away? And I think this is an invitation again to take a look and find areas where we can think through what brings us joy and maybe pay attention to and allow space for more joy and more love for yourself to come into your daily life, even in small moments. You know, taking a moment when you are just waking up to be aware of your breath and how it feels in your body compared to how you felt when you first were getting ready for bed and going to sleep. That could be a small moment where you begin to build awareness and open up a space for some joy or for just acknowledgement of what you're going through and what you're waking up feeling like that day, and then finding ways to tap back into that. So if we think about what encompasses self-care with the mind and the body, we think about nourishment. We think about simple things like hydration, quality of sleep, how much joy you're experiencing on a daily basis, what's impacting your sense of security in the world, especially with all of the unknowns with GNEM progression, or with regards to what you're given, what information you're given in clinic. The connections that you have, meaning deep connections with other people. We're social creatures, and it can be very isolating when you have disabilities. So are you finding ways to build and sustain connection with others. The love that you're experiencing in your life, the level of love with your family, and also romantically, love for yourself, self-love, and getting a sense of your level of peace with yourself, with your life, with what's happening. And this is something I think is very, very important to tap into as a person with a neuromuscular condition. Is peace can tend to be a real strong foundation for almost all the other things we're going to discuss. Then there's energy and inspiration. And so where are you in terms of your level of inspiration in general, within specific projects or work that you're involved in, with your life, with your health, with yourself? And then ultimately, all of this leading to your sense of freedom. So to have a healthy mind and body, we need to feel free in the world, free in our life, and free in our body. That can be really, really challenging to experience with a neuromuscular condition. And so I think it's important, and it's bolded here, to emphasize this is a big challenge for people with neuromuscular conditions. I think it's something worth taking a look at and trying to cultivate. So I think it's important to understand why self-care is important. It might seem obvious, but there are scientific facts that that researchers have documented and published about, and that really validate what I think a lot of people have experienced naturally, which is kind of common for science. There may be things we just think we know, but we also need to find out why and how to prove it so that we can understand it better and then try to cultivate it or try to protect it. Self-care can definitely impact your quality of life. So especially as a person who has multiple physical symptoms. So it's even more important for someone whose body is already constantly dealing with a neuromuscular condition like GNEM. There's a lot going on and buffering in the background with regards to your body and your immune system. And so self-care practice and taking the time to build it up and to understand it, put your thought into it, is even more important. So there is a publication that came out in 2004. There are many publications on this topic, but people with multiple physical symptoms are at a significantly higher risk for mood disorders. And mood disorders can come in many shapes and sizes, but will impact your body's physiology, what's going on with your brain chemistry, your immune system, your disposition to hypertension. So there's so much more that we can do to protect the body through self-care that we have control over, which I think is a very empowering way to look at self-care. But it's very important for people, especially for people with neuromuscular conditions, because we want to try to work on preventive healthcare. So there are many other things that can happen, either because of progressive symptoms or because of just a predisposition to chronic pain or discomfort. Self-care becomes even more critical for making sure that we find ways to replenish ourselves and honor ourselves mentally and physically, especially because of having a neuromuscular condition. And I think it's also important just to validate you by saying you deserve to experience joy, happiness, wellness, and to thrive. It's not just about getting through these challenges, but it's about thriving. And I think that's something that is important to say to one another over and over again, but especially with individuals who are navigating GNEM, is that you deserve to experience wellness and to thrive. I think that really sets the tone for doing a deeper dive and workshopping some of this self-care we're going to do today. So the first step with self-care requires self-reflection. This is really This can be something that people feel is a luxury, but it's really not a luxury. It's a necessity. And so if you haven't taken a moment to reflect on how you're doing on a deep level in different areas and categories in your life, you're not prioritizing your health in a way that you could be, that could really affect how your ability to thrive or the level at which you're allowing yourself to thrive. And so it's easier said than done. Self-reflection requires quite a bit of humility. I recently heard somebody share that some of their deepest feelings bring up so much pain and sadness that they have been afraid to really deeply self-reflect. And one of the ways they handled that was by writing down for themselves in a journal those painful feelings, acknowledging them, statements they might have about themselves or misperceptions they have about, or fears or anxieties. And after they write it out, they burn the pages because they don't want, they release it from their body and their mind, but they need privacy and protection. That's one practice that can be a bit dramatic, but might be therapeutic. But it's also light. It can also be just curiosity. You can, if it's overwhelming to think about a dramatic self-reflection process for you, maybe you just try on curiosity for the day. Maybe today you're just going to be curious, like you would when you're meeting somebody new, asking them what they like, what they don't like, where they like to go, being curious about yourself and your thoughts. Maybe just being curious, saying, what is it that is holding me back right now from feeling great? Or maybe something lighter where you just ask yourself, why do I feel so anxious about accepting that invitation to go, over to someone's house for dinner? And you are going to probably come up with a lot of specifics about why that anxiety exists for very good reason. But writing it down and journaling and then reflecting on that and simply the act of deep internal listening can begin to lay the groundwork for you to make space for those feelings. So they're not necessarily trapped and blocking your joy, but you acknowledge those feelings. Yes, I feel a lot of anxiety about going over to a friend's house for dinner because I don't know how many curbs I'm going to encounter along the way. I don't think that they're set up to help me with regards to if I have a fall while I'm there, or they don't have a wheelchair accessible home. Or maybe you're earlier on and you haven't acknowledged what you're going through to your community and you would love to have a dinner with a friend, but you don't necessarily want to talk about some of the hardest things you've been dealing with. You just want to have a nice light dinner. There can be so many reasons why you feel anxious as a person navigating neuromuscular disease to try to be social. And so that's just one example, but being curious about the why is one of the first steps in building a self-care framework. And so journaling, deep internal listening is a great practice. Listening to what's going on in the background as you're navigating your day, maybe jotting it down or just practicing being mindful of it. Meditation has proven benefits to our health and is offered by the NDF regularly, a guided meditation. We'll have a resource about that at the end. That's a practice that studies suggest you don't have to be an expert to benefit from meditation. In fact, beginners sometimes benefit more because they're not overthinking it. And then identifying your triggers. So part of self-reflection is understanding moments that come up, whether they're physical or mental or both, that trigger you into kind of a spiral that is negative or that is challenging emotionally or physically. So contemplating where those feelings come from and then acknowledging them and making space for them. And at the end of it all, not being so focused on the outcome or what you have, just the act of the reflection itself, tuning into yourself, is really the beginning of laying this foundation for yourself to then feel firm upon. So it's not that you reflect on it, you make space for it, and then something positive has to happen. It's not goal-oriented that way. It's just simply the act of being there for yourself and getting to know yourself. And so in a previous seminar, Tasia Valenza spoke about how our relationship with ourself is the most important relationship of our life. And so it's astonishing to me that we don't learn more about self-reflection from a younger age, that sometimes we wait for something to happen, or we get so low that we have no other choice but really to begin self-reflection. Whereas it's such an integral part of the relationship with ourselves, knowing ourselves and being gracious with ourselves, being kind to ourselves through our self-talk. So the first step is being aware of where you're at with your own self-talk and your image of yourself. So one of the practices I've become aware of through the community that I've served over the years is the ability to shift and redirect regularly. And I think the word regularly is really key here, because I think it's sometimes invisible to able-bodied community members, all of the changes and feelings that are going on physically and mentally for people with neuromuscular conditions. So you might be changing, but your doctor might not see it yet, but you can feel it. Or you might be going through where one thing worked for you before and it no longer works for you anymore. So having the ability and awareness that it's important to shift and redirect, you can think of it as when we go, if we were to go and learn about proprioception physically, the body can adjust. If something is off, the body will compensate or adjust with posture or with the way you approach certain activities of daily living. It can be the same for your mental health. So how are you shifting and redirecting challenges that come up for you mentally, whether they were sparked by physical changes or a loss of function, or that you feel the dread that something is changing? How are you shifting and redirecting? Are you shifting and redirecting? And if not, how can you start to do that? So one way is to take a look at yourself and say to yourself, how are you? How are you speaking to yourself? How are you caring for yourself? How are you prioritizing yourself? So taking a look at that. Talking about others or comparing yourself to others, getting hypervigilant about comparison, especially other people with GNEM, can be pretty taxing on your psyche. And so it's natural to want to compare yourself. It can actually be healthy in some respects to compare yourself if you're in a study and you get some data back from the researchers and you can take a look at what they learned about the cohort of individuals in the study. You can think about where you might fit in with that, but it's a slippery slope because people progress at all different rates and go through different milestones at different times in terms of the disease progression. And so it can be a bit of a slippery slope if you're comparing yourself to others, because if you slip too far down that comparison road, you might feel some extreme stress, wondering what's coming next and is it coming next week? How fast am I going to be changing? The unknowns and even the knowns can be exacerbated, the stress from not knowing, or the stress from knowing what's coming and wondering when it's coming. That can all be exacerbated by comparing yourself to other people. So there's healthy comparisons when you're thinking about data and when you're ready to prepare yourself for proactive support. Like if you have a sense that you're going to want to start using assistive devices, when you are ready and acknowledging when you are ready to begin to think about that, taking it in small chunks where you just think about it a little bit and you don't let yourself obsess about it. So you find ways to redirect yourself. For some people, it brings them a lot of comfort to read everything they can get their hands on. For other people, that is overwhelming and they do not want to know, it's too much for them. So some people would love to listen in on a scientific discussion like Dr. Leck gave for the NDF in the speaker series a couple of years ago. That to some people, it brings them a lot of comfort, even if they don't understand the science, because they can see so much is happening. Other people, it's overwhelming because it sounds like Greek to them and they don't understand it, or they're overwhelmed and they don't want to learn about it right now. And that's okay. And maybe in a few years they're ready. So that's where we shift and we stay open to the changes mentally and physically. A really big area that can be counterproductive with self-care is criticizing yourself. This is something that can be a lifelong learning process, and it really directly relates to self-talk. So if we're criticizing how we look, or if we're criticizing how we're performing, or we're criticizing how we're feeling even, it's really counterproductive, and it really can reduce the energy that we feel. And so all of these things we're talking about all line up with the idea that energy is something that has to be especially nurtured when you're navigating GNEM or a neuromuscular condition. Your energy is gonna be everything. And so finding ways to preserve that energy and to honor yourself over time stacks up and can create a really strong foundation for you. This can come to play with your social life. Energy vampires or drama can really be draining, or they can make you feel like you have energy if you're getting really worked up in certain conversations online maybe, or just with drama with people that you know. However, the end result is being extremely drained. So even if temporarily you might feel energized from the discussion, in the end it can be incredibly draining on your energy and take you down another spiral. So it might be healthier for you not to be as engaged for a period of time. You might want to give yourself a break from being engaged in certain communities and focus on communities that feed your soul and that feed your sense of wellness. So really being aware of how you feel when you engage with certain people or groups online, in person, is really the first step. Again, the self-awareness. And I think another important point that I've observed in people who are thriving with neuromuscular conditions is they have learned how to reframe how they see wellness, as we spoke about earlier in the presentation. And so letting go of old beliefs or views of yourself, what you thought you should be doing or you should look like, or how your life should go. There's a grieving process, and there's also a reframing process that can take place that can be part of your self-care. So something that we can think about is intentionality. And then really trying not to put yourself in overwhelming situations, I think can be really helpful in preserving your energy. So being aware of situations that overwhelm you. If you know traveling is extremely overwhelming and scary and produces a lot of anxiety, then really picking and choosing, still getting out there, but not forcing yourself into situations without putting thought and care into how you're going to go about doing that, finding support systems, getting information, and setting yourself up for success instead of throwing yourself into overwhelming situations and learning through trial and error, which is quite common, that people are learning how to navigate their disease progression through painful trial and error. There isn't a lot of guidance on how to navigate certain situations in the world, getting to and from work, or how to discuss or not discuss your condition with colleagues or family, or how to navigate dating as a single person or a young adult, or later in life while you are navigating GNEM. these situations can be extremely overwhelming. And so taking some time to honor how you're feeling about them, and then coming up with a nice self-care game plan of how you're going to set yourself up to be successful in areas that are important to you in your life. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty a bit with regards to creating a dynamic self-care framework. So what is that? So this is where we can take an inventory about ourselves, reflect. This is not something we would do in a very short period of time. This would be done over time. But just to give you an overview, you can take some time through your journaling and through meditation and through taking a literal inventory of what the components of your life that will build and support and bolster wellness. And then after you have that inventory in different categories, you can calibrate it to how it relates to your GNE progression. And so, for example, certain things that energize you at certain stages might be different later. And so this is an extremely dynamic process. It's not a one and done, oh, I've done my framework, check the box, I am now good for the next decade. I think that that's a myth, and we get very goal oriented, but this is like a fine tuning, natural, organic, dynamic, flowing process. So how you feel one day might be very different from the next. And so remembering that you are not fixed, you are constantly changing and evolving. And so asking yourself as you go through that inventory, you can put it into different categories, or you can just make a long running list and then look at that list and chunk it into categories, aspects of your life. Some of those might be just overview for yourself. What energizes you right now? What are some things what are some times in your life when you feel the most energy and you feel the happiest? And then, are there opportunities to add to your life, adding more movement? Maybe it's just a movement of stretching your neck when you feel tension. Instead of waiting and thinking, oh, I'm tense right now, tonight before bed, I should stretch. How about just taking a moment right now and tuning in and saying, oh, I'm going to honor and make space for how I'm feeling right now, give myself a little stretch. Practicing ways to add that into your life. Adding in breathing exploration into your life. Are there times where you can take 20 seconds and do a breathing exercise? Because we've learned scientifically that does impact your vagus system. And so the nerves directly connecting to your nervous system, your heart, your breathing, your diaphragm, taking slow, measured breaths for 20 seconds a few times a day. That could be something that you add in to create a self-care framework. Maybe there's something spiritual that brings you a lot of joy. You know, taking time to feel grateful for your life and for what's happening, or for a loved one, or for a person that was kind to you, or for something you cherish in nature, or a memory that brings you a lot of joy. Spirituality is shown to be impactful for a wellness and a sense of wellness. And then creating, I think adding in creativity, I have watched that transform the lives of patients in the dysferlinopathy community. And so I think it's important to consider adding in creativity. That can look like thinking up a new program, or thinking up a new topic to discuss on a speaker series, or a project that you want to at least design and then have someone do, or creating a new recipe, or it could be anything at all. But for example, one patient, she decided to create a layered small advocacy piece to put on Instagram that layered in audio. It layered in storytelling in a few different aspects. So there was audio, there was written quotes that were put up, and then there were images, so the visual side of it. So she created a layered storytelling piece to share for people with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. It was an incredibly empowering outlet for her, and it taught her so much about the community and also about herself. And I think that so many times the focus for people with neuromuscular conditions is on what is being lost. But by being creative, you're adding in and you're building something, and you're creating more of something. And so there's the act of doing that can be extremely therapeutic, especially for people who feel constant loss. Then there's advocacy levels. This is really interesting because as a professional patient advocate, we are taught to focus so much on building engagement and advocacy, but I believe that it's important that this is a case-by-case situation that is allowed to change. Maybe you felt extremely energized being included in advocacy work for the first 5 years of after your diagnosis, and then you realized it wasn't bringing as much energy, it was doing the opposite. So you need to do it in a different way, or step back and maybe be quietly behind the scenes and observing instead of being the one on the front line of that. Or maybe you want to add in advocacy. You've never really thought about how to become more of an advocate, but a lot of people find that that energizes them and bolsters their sense of place and community and connection and wellness. There's social activity levels. They can change. If you found that you've been isolating yourself for fear of going out, or obstacles in your environment, not being able to go to places that are accessible enough for you, or you haven't shared your diagnosis with others in your community, taking a look at the impact that is or isn't having on you and your sense of wellness is important. And then find ways to create and cultivate close relationships and have identity beyond diagnosis is very, very important. And I've seen that with longtime patient advocates in the dysferlinopathy community. They really thrive when they have close relationships. There don't need to be a ton of them, but having people who get you and who you check in with is very integral to wellness. And then there's your physical health. Are you ignoring your physical needs? Would you do that to a loved one? And if not, why would you do that to yourself? We can all relate to this, I think, where we put ourselves last so many times. But really, our physical health is everything for how we're feeling mentally. So taking some time to take an evaluation and find ways that you can bolster your physical health, even if it means that you're going to make sure you're getting nourished and you're getting hydrated each day, or you're going to create a new sleep hygiene practice. And there are lots of tools we can talk about at the end that can help you along the way with that. And then, of course, gratitude lists. I'm a firm believer in that. And I think that the people I've observed who are navigating neuromuscular disease, they have a really healthy balance between acknowledging things that are incredibly traumatic and also acknowledging things that are awesome. So it's a balance. It's not an unhealthy balance. It's not someone who refuses to acknowledge how hard things are or the trauma or make space for it, someone who buries their head in the sand. It's not necessarily a healthy balance, but somewhere in the middle can be a very powerful place to be. And I think it's important to also accept your feelings and allow yourself to grieve all the time. It doesn't need to be, oh, I grieved in the beginning. No, it's a constant changing body. The symptoms are progressive, and allowing space to have those feelings and to grieve can build stamina and can be very, very healthy for the body. Practicing self-care can build your self-esteem. And so having a sense of, yourself and your self-worth is critical. And you can seek positive influences within the GNE community. There are a lot of resources, there are a lot of mentors, and there are a lot of people between the researchers, other patients, patient advocates, and medical doctors who are passionate about GNEM. You can seek positive influences and feed that to yourself. So much of what we talk about with social media is our feed, what's coming up in our feed. That's an AI generated feed that isn't necessarily feeding our minds with the intention of wellness. It's more of an intention of consumerism on every level. So take a moment and think about how you are feeding yourself. What are you putting into your feed intentionally? Who are your influences? Who is influencing you? Who are your influencers? And create them for yourself instead of passively allowing them to become whatever AI thinks they should be. Finding a safe place to externalize your feelings. Sometimes just speaking your feelings, the act of speaking your feelings, can help release them from the body and can be pretty scary. So if you are feeling a lot of anxiety about that, you can do that with yourself. And if you haven't, but ideally you would find a counselor or a trusted friend that you can speak your feelings directly to without filter. But if you're not in a position to do that, you can do that with yourself through some of the exercises we talked about earlier with journaling and meditation. You can choose to engage or disengage at different times. It doesn't have to be one way. So if you have made the identity for yourself that you are active and you are a fighter, that's great. But don't be afraid to shift how you perceive yourself. It's a dynamic process if you need to step back and observe more for a while. And then learning how to self-advocate is a huge part of the self-care framework for a person with GNEM. So advocating for yourself about your needs is not necessarily something that anybody thought they would have to sign up for at in such a critical way. So learning how to speak up about how your body needs to be cared for if you have a caregiver. Learning how to speak up in a medical appointment when you feel that your needs are not being met or you don't even know what to ask for. Learning how to articulate that. Advocating for yourself in a public space if something comes up and you need help, or just communicating to people your boundaries. And then finding ways to adjust this self-care plan regularly. So once you have taken time to reflect and you've taken time to make your lists of areas of your life that are working and areas of your life that you think you could add to in terms of these categories of relationships and self-talk and advocacy and creativity, spirituality, health, all those practices, you can create your categories and then you can focus on a couple of them for periods of time and document how you're doing that so that over time you've invested in yourself. So with that, I want to quickly talk about some resources that are available. I've divided this up into articles, videos, publications. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much out there, and so one size does not fit all, but I think it's important to at least demonstrate to you that there are scientific peer-reviewed publications on the importance of self-care, especially for people who have chronic physical symptoms progressing over time. It's even more important. So there is information out there that's validated for you, and you can read all sorts of information about that. But there's also articles, really fun, more casual articles online. One of them is trendable.com. And this is where I've got a bunch of these apps listed on this slide, but this is where there are apps specifically great for people who are navigating physical disabilities or just disabilities in general. One that I think is important to draw your attention to is called ICE, in case of emergency. And this has a service where even if your phone dies or is lost, your emergency contacts can be notified depending on how you set up your profile, and this can bring a lot of peace of mind to people who are navigating changes with physical symptoms, but still, you know, not necessarily in a groove with how they're supporting their body with assistive devices, or you might just be feeling extremely vulnerable. And so having this app can be just bring peace of mind in terms of making sure that your loved ones or your support system knows if you need help. Then there's all sorts of different apps for meditation and for sleep promotion. Sleep hygiene is very individual. And in our society where we go, go, go all the way, all day, we tend to put ourselves last. And yet that's when we have a hard time relaxing and sleeping, because it's finally quiet enough for our mind to process all the things it needs to process, including trauma, including stress, especially those things, which doesn't promote sleep. And so it's really important to take a deep look at your sleep hygiene and try not to put yourself last each day. So Day One Journal is an online journal if you like online instead of handwritten journaling. Another one I think is interesting to explore is called Aloe Bud, which can help you with breathing exercises. The breath work that can be ancient in certain practices like yoga has been studied more and more and is fascinating, and definitely an instant way to calibrate your nervous system. So I think that one might be kind of a fun one to check out because it's instant in terms of what it can do for you. There's also virtual coaches. So I put in bold the apps that are specific for people who have disabilities. One that I did not know about, but I will be sharing more and more, is called Glimmer. And so for people who are dating, people with disabilities who are dating, that can be quite an interesting process. And so Glimmer is an inclusive dating app that is really more geared towards complete transparency and trying to have fun with dating without the kind of historical negative interactions that people online have through ghosting, or are just the surprises maybe people have when they meet in person after having communicated on apps. And so Glimmer, I think, is trying to combat that. Anyway, just wanted to put that on here for people who are navigating that. And then one of the last ones, maybe one of the most important ones, is called Access Now, which is an accessibility support map. So if you are going to a conference and you are needing to come up with like getting a map of how your logistics are going to work, down to all sorts of details with stairs and elevators and transportation, ground transportation, things like that. Access Now is set up to help people identify accessible logistics wherever they are, like a GPS. So that one might be worth taking a look at. And then we've got, I thought it was important to note on here that even the CDC has information on the importance of your mental health as a person with a disability. You're predisposed to have such a harder time with cultivating mental health. And so that's one of the reasons why I feel so grateful and happy that the NDF has made it a priority to include this in the webinar series, because it tends to be looked at as a luxury. But I really believe that for anybody, but especially people with neuromuscular conditions, self-care is vital for your happiness and wellness as you navigate the progression. So with that, I will end my presentation and open it up to discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You've given us a lot of food for thought. Oh, wow. I love the resources. And I like your idea of self-care, where we meet ourselves, where we are right now. That's so important. And to use positive affirmations and be mindful of the kind of messages we're sending ourselves. It's very important. There's a question in the chat box. Someone is asking, what is trendable.com?
So trendable.com is the website that is focusing on people with disabilities and ways that they can help themselves through kind of sharing information. Like this one article was about some of the best apps for people with disabilities. And you'll notice in their name, they use able, and that's from the beginning of this talk today. That's something that I've been drawn to, is focusing on what you are able to do. But that website is specifically for people with disabilities to find resources.
Thank you. I have, I have some challenges staying hydrated, because if I drink 8 glasses of water, I'd have to be constantly going to the bathroom. And with our condition, that's a bit difficult and challenging. Are there like fluids that will keep us hydrated without having to drink the volume of liquid?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that one. Might be interesting to specifically ask about drinks that have enzymes, electrolytes, things like that. But I also think it might be worth investigating whether that effect of being hydrated, or getting hydrated rather, when you go from being dehydrated to hydrating, you're having to use the bathroom all the time. But I believe that tapers off once your body gets fully hydrated. I think it changes a bit, but that's always going to be a challenge for people, especially people who are using wheelchairs most of the time or full time. So I think that one I'd need to do a little more digging and to ask some of our medical professional colleagues about ways that you can be hydrated without maybe the volume of water, or whether or not your body, once you are caught up and fully hydrated, if it's still the same process for you, or if it's a little bit different, if your body's holding on to it differently. I think also taking a look, working with a nutritionist would be phenomenal. So if you go to a multidisciplinary care team, requesting to work with a nutritionist specifically on ways to hydrate yourself, like if you are eating more foods that contain water versus just drinking another glass of water, but maybe instead you're balancing it out with trying to focus on foods that have a lot of water content.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to write it in the chat box or raise your hand. You know, early in the condition, I was really self-critical about the way I walk and how I look. And I think I've heard from other patients, they felt the same way. Can you give us some tips on dealing with self-criticisms?
Well, one of the things that has been profound to me personally and professionally is watching people reframe that self-criticism. And what I observed was the catalyst for that was spending time with other people with the same condition. Because I think I've been told that it's been life-changing for people. And I think it's life-changing in that they see themselves differently. That hyper self-criticism changes when you have met people that you admire and respect, that look like you, have the same gait that you had, the same changes, the same compensations, and you can talk and have a community together. I believe that's had a huge shift in self-criticism for the people who've gotten to that point. And I think too, it takes time for people to feel ready to connect like that. Sometimes it takes years for people to feel ready for that. However, when they do, I have watched how it changes how they see themselves, which changes their self-talk. But I think, Tara, self-criticism, we have to constantly calibrate and work on it as we change. It's just also natural, regardless of having a neuromuscular condition. So it's even more important that we practice, like you were saying, the affirmations, because what we think over and over becomes what we believe. So if we are thinking that we should be different, or we should be doing something differently, or our body should be different over and over and over, then it becomes a belief. Then we believe that, and that is a very deep feeling if we feel that something is wrong with us.
Thank you. I have a comment from another patient. She says, "Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciate all your advice, research, and support. It's definitely food for thought and has reminded me of a lot of things I need to practice and continue to practice. I really enjoyed this session. Thank you so much. I have to go now. Lots of love."
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. And, you know, many of the patients with our condition are, they still have a full-time job and they have a growing family. And it's so hard for them to pay attention to themselves and to take care, to do self-care, you know, until they're totally burned out. And I think, you know, can you explain a little bit more on how they could put themselves first?
Yeah, it makes me think about what we were chatting about before the webinar today. What I was thinking of nicknaming self-care snacks. I love
Yes.
snacks. And that's what makes me giggle, because it's like, oh, I can think of snacks in other ways, like self-care snacks. So if you you have so much going on, you have so much on your plate, taking 20 seconds to do some type of self-care where you just stop and you breathe, or you stop and you listen to yourself, or you get curious about yourself in this very moment. You try to get to know yourself a little bit better. That can be the very beginning of a self-care act. So it could be a self-care snack. You can take maybe 5 snacks each day. Right after you do one activity and you're on your way to, maybe even when you're getting a snack, maybe that would be a good time for a self-care snack. But at different moments of your day, you can try to implement something. So it could be you decide, okay, this is a lot for me to think about. I'm just going to try one thing for a while. And that one thing is, I'm going to say an affirmation to myself. And that affirmation could be like every morning when I'm going to brush my teeth, or every morning right before my caregiver arrives, I am going to say to myself, you deserve wellness, you deserve to thrive. Maybe that's it. And maybe you just practice that for like a month, and you do it you pair it with something you're already doing every day that you know you already do. And it takes, I don't know how long that took me, like 2 seconds. And that can be the beginning of self-care. So you don't have to put the pressure on yourself to create this huge framework today. That was just an overview of where you can take it, but even small acts can stack up and add up.
Thank you. Well, I think we are at the end of the session, and on behalf of everyone from the Neuromuscular Disease Foundation and our patient community, we extend our gratitude to you, Sarah. Thanks for this very impactful session. And a video of today's presentation will be on our website soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Take care.
Take care.